In this tutorial, we are going to go over how to set up some simple AOV or render layers in Unity and make a turntable animation. This is a really good way to show off portfolio work or render out animations and have them look a little bit more professional. We're going to be in Unity. We're going to go to New Project in the hub, and you have to make sure you choose 3D HDRP. I'm going to be using the core one, so it's going to be a blank scene. I'm going to name my project AOV demo and save it onto the desktop. When it finally loads, this is what you will see. You can close the HDRP wizard, we won't be needing that, and I'll just click anywhere in the scene to get rid of the default stuff in the inspector. You're going to be given a few models, or a model with some textures, and we'll be importing those in just a moment. If you have not used the HD render pipeline before, you do get some slightly different textures than you would in the URP. The base map will look pretty much the same. It'll just be color. It also has transparency loaded in. In emissive, if you have emissive information, this will have a lot of information on it. And the one that will be really different is called a mask map. And this is actually 4 different textures that are combined into one in the red, green, blue, and alpha channel. And then the normal map will be the same. And the ones that we will be using have a lot of emissive information, which is a glow effect, and we'll be setting up the glow in Unity as well. I'm going to drag all 4 of these texture files into my assets folder. And while I'm here, I'm going to right click in my assets, create a folder, and I'm going to call it materials. And I'll select these 4 and drag them in. We also have a 3D model that we're going to need. And it is a high poly model with UVs. The UVs are not ideal, but they will definitely work. I'm going to left click, hold, and drag and drop my model to my hierarchy. It should come in right in the center of the world. If it's not, I'm just going to zero out these X, Y, and Z coordinates. If you want to make it a little bit bigger, you definitely can. The size is somewhat irrelevant since it is not going to be a game prop. We're just going to be looking at it. We have the sky and fog volume right in the center. It does not matter where this is in your scene as long as it exists somewhere. We also have our main camera and a directional light. I'm going to first set up my material. We'll open up my materials folder, right click, create a material, which is about halfway down, and I'll just call this demon head. Setting up the materials is very easy. The first one is base color, then emissive, mask, and normal. I'm going to drag the base color, left click, drag, and drop to my base mat. You'll notice that I don't see anything on my model. That's because they are not assigned. So all I have to do is drag the material onto the model. I'm going to do my mask map next. Drag that, which is kind of the green one. Then my normal map, which we'll need to fix in a moment. And then if you scroll down, we have emission. It'll say emissive map, which is the second texture. I'll drag and drop that on. Now we're getting some display errors, and the main one is on the normal map. In the URP, it'll ask you if you want to fix your normal map. HD does not ask you this, so click on the normal map and go up to where it says default and change it from default to normal map, and then hit apply. It'll look much better. And I'm going to select all 4 of these textures And regardless of how big your textures are, whether they're 512 or 8K, Unity will use them as a 2K map. So I'm going to select 2K and change it to 8K and hit apply. It'll do all 4 of them at the same time, and our textures will just be a lot clearer. On my material, if I scroll down, I have a checkbox that says use emission intensity. I'm going to turn that on and pick a color that I want my emission to be. An emission is a glow effect. If I turn it up a lot right now, I will see a preview of it happening down here. However, I will see nothing on my actual model, and that's because we need to enable post-processing for it to be a visual effect. So we will dial in the emission intensity later, but do know that we will be changing the emission to get it to glow. We currently have a sky and fog volume. If I turn this volume off, we will still have some sky, but the lighting will be a little bit messed up. We are not going to use a physically based sky, so I'm going to turn that off. And instead we're going to be using a HDRI sphere. You can get HDR spheres from Polyhaven, which is a website with hundreds of free to use HDR images. You can also get them from Substance Painter. So in Substance, my assets did not drag over for some reason. There we go. So in Substance, we have our asset browser on the bottom. And if we click on this box on the far right of the assets, it says environments. And these are all the HDR spheres that Painter ships with. It does not matter which one you use, but if you just right click on one of them, you can show in Explorer. That should open up your Explorer. You do not want to remove these from Painter, but you can drag and drop it into Unity, and Unity will have a copy of it. That's the easiest way to get HDR panoramas into Unity. And when I click on one, I need to change the texture shape. Right now it is being used as a 2-dimensional image, which is incorrect. I need to change it from 2D to cube, and then hit apply. Back on my sky and fog volume, I'm going to add an override, come down to sky, and choose HDRI sky. I will turn on the first checkbox, which is asking for a cube map, so I can now left click, drag, and drop my panorama image over here. I will not see anything yet, and that's because we need to update the visual environment. So I'm going to open up the visual environment, and the sky type is looking for physically based sky, which we just turned off. So I'm going to change it from physically based to HDRI. And we can now see the HDR image that we have, and it is giving us different lighting information. You can change the rotation of your image to get slightly different lighting. And you can also change how bright it is. We also have a lot of other options over here. We do have different fog attributes. So if you want to increase how much fog is in your scene to kind of block out that background, you definitely can. But do know if you do too much, it will eventually block out your actual model. And if you don't like the HDR image, you can always drag another one into your scene. So we have the material set up. We have a sky and a fog and a background. I'm going to right click in my hierarchy, come down to volume and create a global volume. This is very similar to the sky and fog volume, but it's going to be for effects instead of the sky and fog. I'm going to call it post processing. And again, it does not matter where it lives in your scene. On the right hand side in the inspector, I'm going to go to Profile, where it says there is no profile, and choose New. This will make a new post-processing profile, and I can now add overrides. I will have the same sky and visual environment, but we already have those in, so I'm going to go straight to post-processing and bloom. And when we set up the bloom correctly, we should be able to see the emissive. So I'm going to turn on quality and set it to high, turn on threshold, intensity, and scatter. And it can be kind of tricky to figure out these settings, especially at first. You'll notice that they don't really do anything. So I'm going to go back to my material for my demon head and scroll down to my emission intensity. And I can turn this up a lot and still see nothing. But if we just type in a much bigger number, so I'm at about 100,000, I think. Yeah, 100,000, we can start to see some glow effect. You can balance it with your post-processing to get a little bit more of a refined look. And if you don't like the color that you chose, go back to your material and choose a different color. So you now have a little bit of a glow effect. You might turn down the exposure on my background. And the more light you have in your scene, the less you'll see the glow, because the light will kind of drown out the emissive. So I might turn down that background a bit more to get more of a glow effect. You will need to have a very large number on your emission intensity. Back on my post-processing, I'm going to add another override for lighting and ambient occlusion. I'll turn on everything down to quality. I will turn up my intensity a bit, change my quality to high, and we can really push the quality settings because we're not going for efficiency in a game. We are going just to try to make it look good. And the ambient occlusion will just offer you a little bit of self-shadowing on the model. And add another override in post-processing, and this time shadows, midtones, and highlights, and turn on all three. And I can now get just a little bit more refined with how I want it to look. You can definitely go too far in either direction and kind of break it, so please don't do that. And it's starting to look a lot better. I do want to have the eyes filled in a little bit with some light. And let's move my directional light down here. So the eyes are a little bit darker than I would like. So I'll right click in my hierarchy, create a point light. So go down to light and point light. It will most likely not be in the correct spot at first. And if you want to turn down the size of these icons, come up to the top right of the viewport, click on the arrow, and we have 3D icons. And I'm just going to drag that down a lot because they are way too big. If you just click on the button, it'll toggle them on and off, which makes it really hard to see them in the viewport. So I have one point light. I'm going to turn up the intensity a bit. You notice when I turn it up a lot, some of that glow effect goes away, That's because the light is drowning it out. You can change the color temperature. Maybe turn down the range a little bit. And I just want to have a little bit of light there. So we're starting to have something that looks kind of fun. And I'm going to organize my hierarchy a little bit. So I'll right click, create an empty game object. I'm just going to call it scene. And I want to put my point light, my demon head, and drag them into the scenes folder. Except before you do that, make sure that your empty game object is centered. So right now the position is not zeroed out. So I'm going to make sure it is centered at 0, 0, 0, and then put these items back in. When I click on my game object called scene, I should be able to rotate it and have my object spin around. If you don't want to see this shadow from the horn on the face, which is being caused by the directional light, you can put the sunlight, which is a directional light, into that scene folder as well. So when you rotate it, the lighting will remain consistent throughout. However, the sun will be moving in the background, which can be kind of irritating. So for now, I'm going to leave the sun outside of it. You can disconnect the sun from being an actual sun light source, but for now, I'm just going to keep it slightly different. So right now, I have a scene. If I click on my game view, you notice that my game camera is not seeing the same thing, and I want them to match. This is the view that I want to render from. So I'm going to click on my main camera, come up to game object, and go down to align with view. That will then align my main camera with my scene camera. I can move my scene camera around, and the game camera will remain stationary. On the camera itself, you do have some options. If you turn on physical camera, you can have access to your focal length, aperture, and a few other options. If you want to do depth of field, you need to turn on a post-processing, add override, post-processing, and you have depth of field. You have two options, physical and manual. Manual is done through the post-processing volume. Physical is done through the camera. You go back to the camera, and then you'd be able to control your aperture and your focus distance. But for now, I am happy with how this is looking, and I want to set up my turntable animation. It is pretty easy to do. I'm going to open up my window, come down to animation, and open up the animation window. It will come in looking just like this, and I'm going to drag and dock it down next to my project and console window. I'm going to click on my game object called scene, and in the animation window, it says to begin animating scene, create an animator and an animation clip. Hitting the create button will do both of that for you. So I'll hit create. I'm going to make a new folder called anim, and this is going to be rotation animation, and save. The really nice thing about animating in Unity, if I can find my project, is that now we have an animation clip, which we haven't actually made yet. There will be a clip, and you can just drag and drop it onto any object. So let's say you have 5 different things that you want to have a turntable animation on. You just drag the animation clip onto your object, and then it will have the exact same animation. So now that we made a clip, by hitting create, we can add a property over here on the left, and I want a transform property and a rotation. I'm going to hit the plus sign. I now have some keyframes. I'm just using the scroll wheel to scroll out. And it gives us 2 keyframes, one here and one at 1 second. I'm going to delete the one at 1 second, so just left click, and drag a box around it and hit delete. This is the first keyframe that I want. I want it starting right here, and it's already keyed. So I'm going to type in 150, and that will bring us to 150 frames in. And I'm going to rotate my Y direction 90 degrees. If you want it to rotate the other way, you can type in -90. Then I'm going to hit add keyframe right here, and that will add a new keyframe. So right now, we have it rotating 90 degrees. I'm going to type in 300, and then for my rotational value, type in 180, add a keyframe, type 450, and then we'll be at 270 degrees, add a keyframe, and then instead of being at 600, we're going to be at 599, because it's going to be the same frame as our frame 0. Then I'll type in 359, and hit add a keyframe. If we hit play, you'll notice that it has a slight ease in and ease out, so it'll slow down a little bit and at the end and then speed up at the beginning. I don't want that, so I'm going to drag a box around all of my keyframes, right click, and go down to both tangents and linear. That will keep it a consistent speed throughout. So now that we have an animation, we can make sure it actually works in the game view. You can see that the game camera is a little bit too close. So I'm going to drag that window to have a split view. And I can just move the camera back a bit. You can also change your focal length, depending on what lens you want. So I might actually change it to an 85mm lens and then just move the camera back a bit. And you can set up your camera however you want, as long as your object is framed. So now we have a very simple animation. It is connected to our scene, game object, and now we need to record it. And Unity has a really nice built-in feature called the recorder. I'm going to go to Window and Package Manager. You don't have to download it, it's already here. You just have to import it into the scene. So I'll change Packages in Project to Unity Registry. And then on the top, I will search for Recorder. Select it and hit Install. It should install pretty quickly. There we go. It won't look any different. However, you go up to Window, General, we will have the recorder, and we can open up the recorder window. It looks like this, and I'm going to dock it next to my inspector. The target FPS, frames per second, is 30. That might not match what the animation timeline is at. So if you click on your scene, game object, and go to the right-hand side of your graph editor or animation editor, you have these three little dots right here. And it'll have set sample rate. It defaults to 60. You can either have the recorder match 60 frames a second, or you can change this to 30 frames. So now it'll be 30 frames a second, which will match here. I'm going to leave it at 60 frames and have my target FPS be 60. These two do have to match, or you'll get slightly different end result than what you might want. For rendering mode, I'm going to go to frame interval, and my last frame is at 599. So I'll start at 0 and end at 599. And I want to make sure that exit play mode is checked. So when I begin, it will automatically exit the play mode when it's done. And then down here, I have add recorder. And we have a few different options. An animation clip will make an animation, Unity animation clip that you can put onto other objects. A movie will create an MP4. Image sequence will give you all the rendered out frames so you can bring them into Premiere or After Effects and create a clip. And an AOV image sequence allows you to do render passes. I'm going to do an image sequence for the first one. I'm going to make sure the source is game view, which is our game camera. For output resolution, I want to change it to at least 4K. You can go up to 8K, which is quite nice, but I'll do 4K. And JPEGs are fine. And then down here are the naming conventions. Since we're not doing a lot of AOV or render layers, you can manually change the name pretty easily. But if you have a lot of different ones that you're rendering out, it's really nice to have it automatically properly rename. So over here we have wildcards, and this helps you very quickly set up naming conventions. I'm going to click on wildcards and open and just click on recorder. I'm going to get rid of pretty much image, take, and frame. Or I'm going to get rid of image and take. I'm going to keep frame. That one's very important. But I do want to have the recorder before frame. The frame will be the 001 image. So I'm going to cut that and put the recorder at the beginning. And we can now see that our naming convention is going to be just AOV image and then sequence 001. AOV image sequence is what this is called. So I'll just call this beauty because it's the beauty render. So now it's going to be beauty 0000 for the naming convention. So the recorder wildcard will take whatever this is called and put it in the naming convention. I'm going to go back to add recorder, and this time I'm going to do AOV image sequence. And for AOV to export, I'm going to change that to occlusion, for ambient occlusion. Make sure that it's the main camera, 4K. This one is going to be an EXR. And for the wildcard, I'm going to add the recorder, cut that, and put that in. And I'm just going to call this AO over here. So it's now going to be called AO with the image sequence. If you have a lot of these to set up, it is much easier just to right-click on it and duplicate. It'll keep the same naming convention and all the same settings. And then you'll be able to change this to, say, emissive, rename the layer to emissive, and then your naming conventions will match. We're just going to do a beauty and an ambient occlusion. When you have it set up, hit start recording. It will record fairly quickly. And it will save all of your images to a new folder here called recordings, and it will have all of your saved out images. And your file format is very important. We don't need the full quality of an EXR and all of its abilities. However, Unity saves out these AOV, especially these AOV render passes, much better as an EXR image. A lot of the time when you render out, your first few frames will be completely overexposed, and then once it gets to a certain amount, that's when it will start to look properly. This issue is avoided if you just save it in as an EXR. So I'll just save everything as an EXR. And that should get rid of any potential issues with the rendering. It much prefers the full EXR file format. already have my ambient occlusion rendered out. The ambient occlusion looked quite nice. So I'm just going to turn that one off and just have my beauty rendered. When you have all of them rendered out, you will have a lot of individual images. They'll be in your recordings folder with the ambient occlusions, which I kept at JPEG. If yours are EXR, that's fine. And then EXR images as well. Windows cannot open them by default, but you should have the plugin open EXR for Photoshop that we used on the previous assignment. EXR-IO. Mine are a little bit overexposed. You'll be able to fix this, hopefully, in After Effects pretty easily. In Photoshop, if you just had one image, you just need to add a levels adjustment layer and play around with some of the brightness. You should be able to do that in After Effects, and we'll do it in the next tutorial.